So not this past Sunday, but the Sunday before, or actually the Monday before, I guess it was, February 12th, was the 212th birthday of Charles Darwin, the British naturalist that we're all familiar with. And it's been said that Darwin came up with the single best idea that anyone ever had. Now, that statement isn't really completely accurate. The concept of evolution that Darwin wrote about and spoke about and taught about was actually an ancient one. It's been around for a very long time. It stretches all the way back to ancient Greece in some form or another, and Islamic and Vedantic thought. We read about it all the way through history and up till Darwin. And over the millennia, that concept developed in various ways. With a lot of naturalists developing it and tweaking it and all that, as they are wont to do. And Darwin refined and published it in his 1859 book on the origin of species. I'm not a naturalist or an expert on Darwin or evolutionary theory, but as I understand it, Darwin's idea was that all species of life evolved over time from a common ancestor. Darwin based his work on the process of natural selection, an idea that was, and still is, popular and controversial, but it changed the world and society at large, and especially the world of science. And let me just say one thing here that I have to say a lot of times to some people who disagree with me about evolution, who make the claim that, well, evolution it's just a theory, just like creationism is just a theory, so we should teach creationism in school as well. And that comment displays a real lack of understanding, of ignorance, of just what the word theory means in the scientific community. A scientific theory, like evolution, isn't just some kind of a guess or a hunch or a deeply held belief, like the idea of the existence of a deity or a creationist view that the world was created by a god in 6 days. A scientific theory is a proposition or a set of propositions that are tested and retested over and over again until they become commonly held views, but views that are still subject to more testing and to possibly being disproven or proven partly correct and not fully correct. And they continue to be tested and developed. Sometimes they might find that they're flawed and they go back and start over again and they're improved on. That's what a scientific theory is. You know, the Dalai Lama, even the Dalai Lama, the head of the Buddhist community in the world, has said that if science proves inconclusively that something in Buddhism is incorrect, then Buddhism needs to change, not science. So today, the laws of nature that Darwin discovered are still really debated, and we continue to learn a lot about them, not only about evolutionary theory, but we also learn a lot about Charles Darwin himself. And so in their book, and I recommend reading the book if you can find it, it's just a couple of years old. It's called Darwin's Sacred Cause: How a Hatred of Slavery Shaped Darwin's Views on Human Evolution. The authors, Adrian Desmond and James Moore, write this. They say, all science begins with certain assumptions about the world. Darwin began with certain assumptions. He believed in history. He believed that everything happens slowly. Everything happens by natural law. These were first principles. These were givens for Darwin. Another given for Darwin was that all the races are members of the same family. And this was ingrained in him from childhood, and it's what led him to theorize about the common descent of all life. Most people don't realize that Darwin came from a very long line of anti-slavery abolitionists on both sides of his family. His maternal grandfather was the renowned potter Josiah Wedgwood, and his paternal grandfather was the Enlightenment philosopher Erasmus Darwin. Now, both of Darwin's grandfathers were committed to abolishing the slave trade that had flourished in England and then in the colonies in America at the time. And in 1807, 2 years before Darwin was born, Parliament did abolish the transatlantic slave trade, and America did that about a year later. So Darwin was born into a world in which half the battle had been won, but the slaves still remained to be emancipated. And so to that end, different societies, different groups of people sprang up in Great Britain and the United States, anti-slavery abolitionist movements, and Darwin's family belonged to pretty much all of them. But it wasn't until he took his trip aboard the Beagle as a naturalist, and he was only 22 when he did this, that he was really confronted directly with what the slave trade really meant and what it was about. Because when the Beagle reached South America, he only had a theoretical understanding of what slavery was and how bad it was. But when he got to South America, he was confronted with the instruments of torture that they used on slaves and the way slaves were treated. And he heard the screams and he heard the cries and he saw what was going on. And suddenly, as he described it, he became fired as never before that this sin, as he called it, should be abolished around the world. And from there, Darwin sees all the horrors of slavery revealed as the trip progresses, and it gets seared into his mind. And so at the very end of the voyage, just weeks before the Beagle reached England, they took a trip back to Brazil. And it was when he was walking past a house and he heard on the other side of a wall the screams going on that he had to do something, but he was powerless at that time to do anything. So when the Beagle got back to Britain within a few months, within his private notebooks, he declared himself a believer in the common descent of all life, all people, all life. In one of his letters to the professor who had been his mentor while he was growing up in England, Professor Lyle, he wrote, "Those who look tenderly at the slave owner and with a cold heart at the slave never seem to put themselves into the position of that latter. What a cheerless prospect with not even a hope of change. Picture yourself the chance of ever hanging over you, of your wife and your little children, those objects with which nature urges even the slave to call his own, being torn from you and sold like beasts to the first bidder. And these deeds are done and palliated by men who profess to love their neighbors as themselves, who believe in God and pray that his will be done on earth. It makes one's blood boil, yet I tremble to think that we Englishmen and our American descendants with their boastful cry of liberty have been and are so guilty." This is a different side of Darwin that we're seeing, that we know about. And you wouldn't find anything like this in a science book today talking about Darwin, because Darwin didn't make this just simply a moral matter, but a matter of religion. That's another thing that people need to understand. Darwin was not an atheist. If anything, he may have been an agnostic, but he wasn't an atheist. And all at the time that science was being used to sustain slavery. And not just used to sustain slavery, science was constructed and it was formulated in a way that kept the races apart. People had recognized differences amongst themselves, from time immemorial, from the beginning of history. And in Darwin's day, the notion of separate races, separate types of human beings, separately created types of human beings, was claimed to be based on science, mainly by measuring people's bodies. You may have heard about the idea of phrenology that people used to believe in. And phrenology was being used as both a parlor game to determine one's future, but also as serious science in the halls of the universities like Edinburgh and Oxford to determine how big a person's brain was or how intelligent they were. You know what phrenology was, right? People, they read the bumps on your head and they would be able to tell things about you. And scientists actually believed in this. I think somewhere around my house, somewhere we have a phrenology head that diagrams what the different bumps would mean. And in the United States, in the 1840s and the 1850s, this was considered to be the best progressive science there was. And Darwin just would have none of it. He stood against it. It was pseudoscience to him. And all his research in the 1850s was devoted to undermining something that people thought was the latest science. Even at Harvard University, there was a professor, his name was Louis Agassiz, and he was Darwin's biggest enemy, his nemesis. He was a popularizer of science, of what they called science, at least in Darwin's day. And he had a big influence, not only at Harvard and throughout the country, but in Washington. And he believed that a strong creationist idea in America had to exist and to resist the amalgamation of Black people with white people because, according to him, God had created them separately and they must not be brought together. And so even Harvard University supported this guy at that time. Oddly, in later years, Darwin and his own natural theory of natural selection was used by others like Agassiz, who twisted Darwin's idea and tried to prove it through scripture, that it was a scriptural idea. It was used by those also in the field of eugenics. Eugenics was a pseudoscience that aimed to improve the races by breeding out undesired traits of the species and strengthening the desired ones. So we had to make people better. One of the people who actually believed this, believe it or not, was Margaret Sanger, the pioneer birth control advocate. Later on, that would be used by people like Adolf Hitler and his Nazi scientists, so-called scientists. And contrary to what those who tried to use it for ends like that, though, Darwin's aim was the abolition of slavery, and probably not intentionally, but helping us to see the interconnectedness of all life and the dignity and worth of all living beings. And that brings me to an aspect of Darwin's influence that I had that happened on my life as I was growing up, my spiritual life. I grew up in a family where evolution, they didn't believe in evolution. God created the world in 6 days. That's the way it went. He created everything separately: trees, plants, animals, human beings, that kind of thing. But then, as I got older, I started reading and studying. And one person who, in recent years anyway, had a big influence on me is someone named Michael Dowd. Perhaps you know Michael Dowd. He's the author of a book called Thank God for Evolution. And I believe Michael Dowd is a former evangelical minister who they travel around now. He travels around speaking at a lot of Unitarian congregations. He's one of the leading proponents of what's called big history, or the great story. And to use a phrase that the Quakers use, Michael Dowd speaks my mind when he talks about his creed, his credo. And his credo says this: first is reality is my God. Second, evidence is my scripture. Big history is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my salvation. And ensuring a healthy future is my mission. Now, by big history, what that means is history doesn't just happen in segments. It's ongoing from time immemorial, before the creation of the world, we're all part of this gigantic, great big story. And I think that the first time I ever had any kind of intuition about this was when I was in high school, and I landed the role of Henry Drummond in a school production of Inherit the Wind. I've mentioned this before in the past. Inherit the Wind is a play by Jerome Lawrence and Robert Lee about the Scopes monkey trials. And it's a romanticized version of the story. And they don't use name Scopes or anything. Everybody's name is changed. But it's those famous Scopes monkey trials that took place in Dayton, Tennessee in 1929. And the character based on Clarence Darrow is named Henry Drummond. And the one based on William Jennings Bryan, who was the prosecuting attorney in that trial, who was also a fundamentalist Christian believer. His name in the play is Matthew Harrison Brady. And this really did occur during the trial, where Darrow did call Brady up as an expert on the Bible because they wouldn't let him have any scientists on the stand. So in the play, they recreate this. And just so you know, there's a great, if you haven't ever seen the movie, you should watch it. Inherit the Wind with Spencer Tracy and Frederick March. Great version of the movie, of the play. And so the first time I saw that movie, and then I read the script when I was going to do the play, it helped me start thinking about my own ideas about God and creation and the universe. And, my mother was very upset, needless to say, when I was doing this play. But one speech by Henry Drummond in that play caught my attention because he has Matthew Brady on the stand. And Brady, at one point, confronts him and says, "Isn't anything sacred to you? Nothing is sacred to you." Essentially, that's what he says. And Drummond gets hot under the collar. And he says this, he says, "Yes, the individual human mind, in a child's power to master the multiplication table, there's more sanctity than in all your shouted amens and holy holies and hosannas. An idea is a greater monument than a cathedral, and the advance of man's knowledge is a greater miracle than all the sticks turned to snakes or parting of the waters. But now," and he's talking to the jury and the judge at this point, "are we to forego all this progress because Mr. Brady now frightens us with a fable? Gentlemen," he says to the jury, "progress has never been a bargain. You have to pay for it. Sometimes I think there's a man who sits behind the counter and says, 'All right, you can have a telephone, but you lose privacy and the charm of distance. Madam, you may vote, but at a price. You lose the right to retreat behind the powder puff or the petticoat. Mister, you may conquer the air, but the birds will lose their wonder and the clouds will smell of gasoline.' Darwin," he says, "took us forward to a hilltop from where we could look back and see the way from which we came. But for this insight and for this knowledge, we must abandon our faith in the pleasant poetry of Genesis." And Brady says, "We must not abandon faith. Faith is the most important thing." And Drummond continues. He says, "Then why did God plague us with the power to think? Mr. Brady, why do you deny the one faculty of man that raises him above the other creatures of the earth, the power of his brain to reason? What other merit have we? The elephant is larger, the horse is swifter and stronger, the butterfly is more beautiful, the mosquito is more prolific, even the simple sponge is more durable." And then he turns to Brady and says, "Or does a sponge think?" And it goes on from there. For me, Drummond's speech in that play was one of those aha moments in life. It articulated something I'd been struggling with as far as my own ideas of God and evolution were concerned. It didn't resolve that struggle all at once, but it set me on a path that would eventually lead me to where I am pretty much now in life, a place where I'd become comfortable living in what I call the great mystery. And this, I believe, was Darwin's greatest gift to us. But it was a gift nonetheless, in a place where we are free to question, to doubt, a place where our thinking can, for all lack of another word, evolve. Darwin gave to us a freedom to explore, and especially to doubt. There's freedom to doubt, to question, to be content to live in mystery. It's central to our liberal religious tradition. And like the process of evolution itself, the path that we follow, our practice, if you will, is not easy or simple. It isn't without its dead ends or its disappointments. It doesn't guarantee that all of our conclusions are going to be final or that we will ever find an answer to all of our questions. But also, like the process of evolution, it is filled with great expressions of beauty and awe that are sometimes born out of great struggle in our lives and at other times just come as unexpected grace. The Catholic priest and social psychologist and lecturer on the subject of evolutionary spirituality, a man named Darmid Murchu, he says, the evolutionary story requires that we listen attentively to the evolving process transpiring over billions of years. Our failure to attend to this expansive vision may well be the major cause of alienation and estrangement that we often experience in our daily lives. I have grave doubts that the story of evolution can be rescued to one cycle, commencing about 12 billion years ago and culminating some 5 to 10 billion years from now. It's all too neat for the creativity of divine becoming. And so for that insight and truth, we can celebrate Charles Darwin on his 212th birthday and his contributions. But let's not forget that evolution is not static, it's process. And that's why we call it evolution. And so too are the insights about evolution itself that Darwin gave us. We've come a long way in our understanding of it since Darwin's day, and there's a lot more to learn. But those insights are what continue to help us understand and continue to prod us on to work toward greater realization of that interconnectedness we talk about all the time. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, what I was brought up believing, perhaps what you were brought up believing, contrary to that, we were not born with original sin, but with original blessing and creativity. And so as the Episcopal Bishop John Shelby Spong, he was the Bishop of Newark, if you recall, he writes this, he says, "We are not a fallen people, we are an emerging people." May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.